So I grew up in a very secular family, actually close by in New Jersey. And my dad's side of the family is actually Quaker Protestant, and my mom's side is Jewish. Some of my frustrations with the feminist movement was like butting up against kind of some of these like generalizations that we do find, like gendered characteristics that we do find in society, and like always trying to be forcing them to be suppressed under this idea of sameness or equality. Um, and so when I was kind of introduced to a woman's role in Judaism, I was just curious for a while, holding alongside my suspicions and like not 100% believing in God yet, but then like a lot of curiosity, like what does this community have?
Welcome to Ordinary People with Extraordinary Stories. I'm Chana Weisberg, host of this podcast. Joining me today, we have the very special Chava Green, who is joining us all the way from Philadelphia. Chava is a wife, a mother, and also has a PhD in Hasidic feminism, which is quite intriguing. Chava, tell us a little about your journey. Let's start us off. Tell us a little about your background and where it all started.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on.
A
Um,
pleasure.
okay, yeah, I've come a long way since my childhood to this stage of my life for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
You also wrote so many articles on our site. I forgot to mention that, which is, anyone who wants to see some of your writing could see some of it there as well.
yeah, fill in more details of the backstory.
Right.
Yeah, so I grew up in a very secular family, actually close by in New Jersey. And
Mm,
my dad's side of the family is actually Quaker Protestant, and
mm,
my mom's side is Jewish.
mm.
And growing up, interestingly, both of my grandmothers were involved in religious communities. My mom's mom was a Hebrew school teacher, and my
Interesting.
dad's father was actually my dad's mother was actually a Unitarian minister.
Oh,
And growing up, looking back after I got more involved with Judaism, I started finding these threads of interesting moments. My Nana would show us this video called Veggie Tales. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but it was like biblical stories, and I grew up
oh.
watching these. But my family itself, we didn't really have any. We didn't really
Did
follow
you
any religious.
practice?
No,
Yeah.
we
Did you
didn't have
practice?
any religious tradition really. I remember
Mm.
people in the schoolyard would ask me, "Oh, like what religion are you?" And I'd be like, "Well, I'm half Jewish and half Christian, and I myself am nothing." you know.
Right.
Um, so
Right.
yeah, I it was interesting to me because my family had strong family culture. We had like a lot
Mm.
of family traditions,
Hmm.
but none of them were tied to any
Religion.
religions. Yeah.
So did you know about like Shabbat, holidays, or it wasn't just
Um,
something that was discussed?
we did celebrate Hanukkah and Xmas,
Hmm.
and then there were years we would visit my Jewish grandparents for Passover, but they
Hmm.
were older, and I didn't connect as much to them, so it felt very like from the old country, like very removed
Hmm.
from me. And
Right.
I had never heard of most of the Jewish holidays. I probably knew of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but like Sukkot, I never heard of. Shavuot, I never heard of. So yeah, I say that I really had no Jewish education.
Uh-huh. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so when and how did that change?
Okay. So in college, well, let's start in high school. So in high school,
Mhm.
I had this dream of going to a liberal arts, small liberal arts school. I was very much creative, and I was a deep thinker. I wanted to engage with like the questions that were plaguing society, and also personally, I was interested in philosophy, and I was an ardent atheist because I had very strong
Mm.
opinions about God, that He didn't exist. Which I think, looking back, is interesting that I was very concerned with these questions. Even though
Right.
I had kind of an immature had made my immature decisions about them, too early. I was really thinking about them, and so in high school, I had this dream to go to one of these very kind of elite, small liberal arts schools, and I was at the top of my class, and I had a lot of great credentials. So it was a very shocking moment when I came back from a family vacation, and I found 10 thin envelopes waiting for me on my front porch. They were all rejection letters. And I
Oh,
opened one at a time, and I just I can, like, zoom back thinking of this moment where I sat there in utter shock that how I'd been rejected and waitlisted from every single college I had applied to,
why do you
and
think you were rejected when you were such a good student?
Um, so I did a little research on this.
Mm,
Actually, like my year, like the millennial generation was one of like the largest generations applying
mm,
to college,
mm,
and colleges had not yet adapted and expanded how many students they received. And I also
right.
think in some ways I didn't have that one particular thing that I would stick out.
Mm,
I had a friend
mm.
who her parents had her travel to 100 countries before she applied to college. Like that could be her thing.
Give
Like
her interesting.
I would think I was like a smart, interesting kid, but maybe I didn't
Mhm.
have that, they're looking for like something that
Something that stands
pushes
out in
pushes you
some
over the
way.
edge. So,
Right,
um
wow.
and on the other hand, I think why that happened is because it was meant to be. Like,
Right, that's for sure. It was the hand of
um
God.
yeah, yeah, and
Right.
actually I think that for me was a turning point where I kind of it shattered a lot of assumptions I had about who I was supposed to be.
What does that
Um
mean? Like, in what way did it shatter? What did you think you were supposed to be? It's funny 'cause I find it interesting that you say you were such an atheist and so strong in your atheism because it's usually people who feel so passionately about Judaism that will or against Judaism or against God or against spirituality
Mhm.
that will try to explore it rather than those who are
Yeah.
just indifferent, so that's interesting. So
Yeah,
what
well,
what were the things that were on your
we're
mind
going
then?
on. So
Yeah.
my mom always told me things are meant to be growing up.
Mm,
And so I had this like sort of, ember of spirituality because when you believe things are meant to be, you know, a few years later I would start thinking, well, who meant it to be that way? you know?
right, right.
And so it kind of struck with me like she told me this was meant to be, and I had to reconcile that a little bit with, all the frustration I'd felt. But really, I had kind of, over high school, I had felt very lonely. I felt like people really didn't understand me.
Mhm,
My parents had gotten divorced when I was in middle
mhm,
school, and at
mhm.
that time period, that was uncommon. By the time I graduated college, most of my friends' parents had gotten divorced, actually,
Right.
and it was much more common. But when I was 13, it was very shocking to me, and so when I was looking ahead to college, it felt like this break free from everything. Like,
Mhm,
and I had, but in a funny way, I had already decided who I was going to be. I was going to be like this kind of liberal, academic, intellectual, social justice, person at one of these schools. And I'd visited them, and all the kids were artsy and interesting and all of this stuff. And I had started modeling my identity after that, I think. And so when I had gotten those rejection letters, within me, I kind of realized that I don't know what's going to happen next. I
mhm,
can't decide that I'm going to be that person no matter what.
mm,
And I had to take stock of kind of some of the ways I had framed my decision making. Like, it has to be a certain way.
mm.
Um,
Did it shake your identity? Like, did it make you feel like, "Well, like, this is what I thought I would be, and then I'm not," you know?
yeah, yeah. I had very much identified with like what my career would be, like my professional life, and like being an intellectual, being interested in academia. I mean, that came a little bit later, but academics were always so important to me, and I
Mhm.
for sure remember the embarrassment of going back to school after that break, and everyone in my AP English was like, "Oh, I got in here, I got in there," and everyone's like,
Oh,
my
wow.
English name is Vera. Vera, where'd you get into school? And it was so embarrassing. I had to say, I'm not sure where I'm going yet.
Right.
And so it was a big turning point for me as a young person. And what happened was I decided to travel that summer.
Mhm.
I traveled around South America. My parents would not let me go by myself, so I joined like a
Mm,
trip, like a backpacking trip. Um, but it was really eye opening to me to see like I loved Latin American culture, and I'd studied Spanish, and to see like how other people live so differently and much more simply. And I remember
mm,
going to Uruguay and speaking to people, and they were like, "Thank you for visiting our country. Like, thank you for seeing what our country is like." And I was thinking, I am so blessed. I've been so sheltered, growing up in a small American town, and not really thinking that there's so many people that live very differently
right.
than me, and have really strong cultural traditions.
Mm.
I mentioned like my family had strong cultural traditions, but they were like a one of a kind, like we didn't like go to like a cultural celebration where there's like a parade, like it was just we would play hearts and we would trade tomatoes for like swimming,
Right.
like little things
Right.
we made up. And I had felt kind of bereft of this bigger picture,
Right.
of being part of something. And so my nana had encouraged me to apply to my state school as like a backup, like you don't
Uh-huh.
have to go there, but just in case,
Were you living
And
with your father or your mother at this time?
I was
It's
so
both.
I'm really blessed that my parents lived only a few blocks away from each other
Mm, mhm,
after they got divorced.
mhm.
So I grew up really sharing time with both of them.
Right.
And I always had a very close relationship with my grandmother. And so she had said, apply to the good old state school, it'll be good for you. So I got into the honors program there,
Mhm.
and I was living in New Jersey, so I was in Rutgers. That's the state school of New Jersey, and it has a huge Jewish community.
Population, sure.
Yes, which was not on the top of my mind, obviously, when I went, but everything was was aligned.
Was preordained, right?
Yeah. So I showed up in college, like, my dad said, "Say yes to everything besides drugs." Like, he was like, like, "This is your time to, like,
Right.
explore." And so I went in that with that mentality of, I don't know who I'm gonna be, but I'm excited to learn and to have different experiences. And so so fast forward a little bit,
Mhm,
I joined a bunch of organizations and groups, and I got really into women's studies.
mhm,
And I decided this is gonna be my major. I was always a tomboy growing up, and I also, the mix of kind of my confusion about where I fit in a little bit, my parents getting divorced and being very nervous about getting into a relationship. I saw around me all sorts of like, very open sexuality, and like it's college.
yeah,
It's a
sure,
bunch of
sure.
teenagers left to their own devices.
Mhm,
And I went to a bit of a party school, and I kept myself very removed from that.
mm,
But I also felt like, is there something wrong with me that I'm not like
mm,
diving headfirst into this whole like young hookup culture?
mhm,
And so in my women's studies classes, we talked a lot about kind of women's role in society and the history of the feminist movement. And it spoke to me in so many ways, like of answering some of these bigger questions I had.
Like
Interestingly, I
what?
took
For example, can you give us an example of, like, what did it answer?
so
Like, were
so
you
I had this
grappling with women's role before? Where you said you went into women's studies. Was that something that you were interested in beforehand, or just
a
because
good
of your
question.
exposure?
Um, I remember like our first class, we had to raise our hand. Do you consider yourself a feminist?
Mm,
And I
mhm,
didn't raise my hand
mm,
because, I felt like in high school it was a little too fringe to be like an outspoken feminist. And I don't think I had a strong interest in kind of a women's role in society or women's rights. Um,
Well,
but
how did
then,
they define feminism at the time? I mean, this is how many years ago?
yeah, so this is like, I guess, so, 15,
Mhm,
maybe a little bit more, 15 years ago. So feminism at that time was, I think, on the cusp of holding on to a more traditional view of what the feminist movement had been, which is
mm,
equal equality for women,
mhm,
equal opportunities and equality for women in society, versus it was moving already towards more radical views of feminism, which at the time were interwoven in the feminist movement, but they were not, I would say, the only voice. For example, so I had feminist professors who were women that came to feminism in the late 70s and 80s, and they had like gone in these very important marches, and they were just saying basic things. Women's rights are human rights.
mhm,
There,
mhm.
so if something is a human right across the world, it should be a right for women. Access
Right.
to, bodily autonomy, access to water and food, and the ability to start your own business. And so I was very like enamored of this, that
Mhm,
how have we not accomplished basic rights for women across the world?
mhm,
Um, and so there was this kind of opening for me into feminism that felt like nothing extreme or niche. It was
mhm,
like really baseline things that I was like, oh yeah, this is really powerful. And then I also had a contingent of professors that came out of this spiritual feminist background. And I don't know if that even exists now in
Right.
academia. It's certainly rare. But at the time, I had a professor who had been a nun for 2 years
Oh,
under a
interesting.
vow of silence.
Wow.
And yeah, and she taught a class called Contemplative Feminisms, and it's talked about the divine feminine and the place for silence and introspection in
Mhm.
understanding how we can transform the world.
Mhm.
And so this was, all very new to me. I wasn't very interested. I didn't have any particular spiritual path, but in my sophomore year, a number of things happened, and I started doing some meditation for more mental health reasons.
Mhm.
And it all was interweaving, like with my
Mhm.
feminist stuff and all these things. So then, where did I encounter Judaism? Okay,
Mhm.
so my sophomore year, I had been playing on an intramural rugby team, and during one of our um, scrimmages, they're called, like with another team, I tore my ACL, which is a ligament in your knee.
Mhm.
And here again was one of those moments looking back, and it was devastating at the time. I basically had to stop everything. I was stuck in my room for like 2 months on crutches, healing.
Wow.
And at that time, two things happened. So in my dorm, we happened to be right next to the Hillel, the campus Hillel. And I had had this very vibrant social life. And when it kind of came to a halt, um, I started spending more time in my dorm. And a lot of Jewish students had chosen that dorm because it was next to the Hillel. I
Mhm.
started hanging out with them, and they invited me to go for a barbecue. And I remember walking up the steps of the Hillel so nervous. I was like, I'm
Yeah.
barely Jewish. Only my mom is. Like, like I don't know anything. I don't know any Hebrew. Like, and
Right.
obviously that didn't matter. But I felt like the Jewish community is so close knit. Like, how could I break into that? And I didn't realize that you can also be born into it.
Right.
So
Wow.
yeah, so that was a moment where I started making a few Jewish friends, and I signed up for the mailing list at the Hillel. um, in the next few weeks, I found out that my grandfather had passed away.
Mhm. This
My
is
grandmother's
your
my
father's or your
my
mother's?
father's
Father's
father.
father.
So my
Mhm.
nana, who I was very close to, was her husband,
Mhm. Mhm.
and he had been sick for a long time. But my parents had not really exposed us to exactly what was going on, and so it was both surprising and kind of I had this feeling of acceptance that it was had been coming.
Mm.
But the night before he passed away, I had this weird dream that someone in my family had died.
Mm.
And I had this like deep, dark sleep for like an hour. And I woke up very disoriented. And I went to class. And in the middle of class, I got a call from my father. And I went outside, and he called me and said, Grandpa passed away. And I feel like. I feel like God knew I needed a little bit of a spiritual experience to kind of
Mm.
like push me out of my complacency. I was like very rational, very logical. Everything had to make sense. And that moment was a little bit of a feeling like, maybe there's like a soul reality. Like maybe there's something else going on under the surface that I don't always see.
Mm.
And that semester, for all of these things that were changing in my life, and my interest in meditation and this spiritual feminism, and connecting to my Jewish students in my dorm, um, that January I had signed up to go on Birthright. And in my mind, it was unrelated. I wasn't like going to Israel to get answers to all my questions and like, reconnect to my heritage. I was like, I love traveling. And I signed up on this Hillel sheet to like go to Israel. So great.
Right.
But this ended up being the turning point
Mm.
for me. So
In what way? How was
Israel.
it the turning point?
So in Israel, I first of all kind of solidified my Jewish identity. I started to identify that, you know, I'm part of this people.
Mhm.
I might have lacked a Jewish education, but I'm not lacking a Jewish identity.
Mhm.
One isn't dependent on the other. That was
Mhm.
very, very new for me to realize.
Right.
I
That's a
thought,
real revelation.
yes, I
Right.
thought like to be Jewish, you have to have a bas mitzvah, you have to go to Hebrew school, you have to say the blessings on the Hanukkah candles, like which we did only on and off. So,
Right.
so for me, that was a big realization. Like I am Jewish no matter what I practice, and
Mhm.
all of a sudden, it felt like this wealth of resources, this treasure that I had never known was available to me.
Mm.
And I was coming to it with all of these questions. Do I have a soul? What happens after you die? what is my place in the world? What does it mean to be a woman and a man? And slowly, I started realizing I didn't know what the answers were at the time, but I had a hunch there might be some answers here.
Hmm. Did you believe in God at the time?
Um,
Or you were
no.
just
So
no.
I was still very skeptical
Mhm.
that there was a God. And growing
So you
up,
thought there might be a soul without a God?
I thought that there might be, like the hippie, like
Mhm.
cosmic universe
Mm, mhm.
energy thing, but I'm not going to call it a name. And it might not have any intention,
Right,
but there is something connecting us. That's kind of where I was at the time.
right. Some kind of powers in the world that
Yes,
made things happen and
something
then
bigger than us, but
right,
to say like a God that created the world and gave
right,
the Bible, and I was like, "Oh, that's too
right,
much." You know?
right, right,
Um,
right.
so when did that shift for me? So I was really blessed to be at Rutgers because it had a huge infrastructure of Jewish life, classes, more trips to Israel, and I just dove in and took advantage of everything.
Mhm.
So I signed up for classes at the Chabad, at the other like outreach organizations, and I
You
ended up
listened
going
to
back
your
to
father
Israel.
to delve into
Yeah,
everything, right?
to say yes,
Right.
My parents were like, "Okay, you
We
did the
didn't really mean
feminism
that.
thing, you're doing a little bit of the Jewish thing, we'll see where you end up."
Oh,
Like, they were, like,
okay.
just waiting to see,
Right.
'cause I from the outside, it probably looked like I was jumping around a lot.
Right, right.
Internally, I felt like I was on a mission to find myself. It was
Mhm,
very clear
mhm,
why I was trying out all these things,
mhm,
but so I went back to campus and I did a lot of research and I met with different people and I asked questions and I decided, okay, I really need to learn Hebrew. I'm very academic, so I'm gonna learn the text in the original language. I
mhm,
don't want anyone
mhm,
translating it for me.
mhm,
Um, and I also had this interaction with an Orthodox woman where she was saying how empowered she felt by some of the Jewish laws surrounding womanhood,
mhm,
like family purity and modesty.
mhm,
And these were really important conversations for me because they tied back into my questions about relationships and sexuality. Because if you remember, I was mentioning like when I first got to college, I saw this kind of party culture that I felt was really bad for women. Like
mhm,
women got taken advantage of a lot. And then it was also bad for the guys because then they got caught up in these things that maybe they regretted. And not everything was inconsensual, but I think that happens a lot, and especially when there's drugs and alcohol involved. And I felt like feminism had made all these strides, but with the sexual revolution and kind of the breaking down of all these barriers around sexuality, I felt like we threw out the baby with the bathwater. Like a
right.
lot of like a very crucial, important part of life was kind of up for grabs, and I really felt like women got the short end of the stick with that.
So all
And
these
maybe
freedoms weren't really freedoms, you're saying, like, all these freedoms and let live and just do anything that you want in terms of sexuality were really oppressing women rather than freeing them.
I think that it depends on, obviously people are going to have different opinions. For
Mhm,
me, it really felt like it was too dangerous of an area
mhm,
to um, let loose without
mhm,
any sort of cultural boundaries. I'm not talking about, like I feel like, there are legal, rules in place about what's allowed or not, but the social and cultural norms really
mhm,
shifted. And I
mhm,
feel like those were important protections
mhm,
for young people in particular. And when those were kind of taken down, I think people were left without a lot of resources of how to navigate this area.
mhm,
And yeah, to women's detriment. And I was really grappling with what could feminism do, like if the cat's out of the bag, like what could feminism do to like reinstate some boundaries in this area. And I kind of had come to the conclusion, like, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know how as a society we could like return to like more, what modesty.
right.
It's
Well,
how do we do that? Like,
is it feminism that let the cat out of the bag? Like, is it feminism that was so or not really? Like,
I
was
mean, it's
it
a good
feminism that
question.
really tried to free women from the oppression of modesty or from sexual, morality and all that, like, to have more freedom? Or was that just society and feminism was there on the Y
Good
side?
point. It's a good
Yeah.
point. Yeah, it's a good point. I think feminism rode the waves of that. But there were bigger cultural shifts happening for sure,
Mhm, mhm,
in the 60s and 70s. I think like the giant cultural shifts, I think that some women frame those in like feminist language, and
Mm-hmm.
for some others it was just how society was changing.
Right.
And as I started getting interested in religion, I realized how much people's religious values had created those society norms.
Mm-hmm.
And so the increase in secularization certainly was part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and you see, like, the spirituality of the 60s and 70s was a spirituality that was specifically not religious. It
Right.
was very much, individual spirituality with like psychedelics and like that whole very hippie style. And I was, coming to feminism so many generations later and thinking, well, what have been the repercussions of this? And so when I encountered a community where women dress modestly, there are rules around sexual relations. Um, I was really drawn to it. I felt
Interesting.
like I felt like this is so powerful, and I so badly wanted to have like a really deep, beautiful, loving, committed relationship. And I had gone through years of college, thinking this is a fairy tale. Like, like, this is not maybe when I'm like 30, the men around me will mature and I'll meet someone.
Right. Wow.
And so when I started going to Shabbos meals at people's houses, and I saw these young women that, just had this kind of inner sense of confidence in themselves
Mm.
that I didn't see in college. And I saw that one thing that was very interesting to me was I met a lot of women that wanted to be a PT or OT, like go into
Right.
like therapy, you know.
Right.
And at the time, I was like, no, the world's open to you. You could be anything you want. And then I thought about like all of my friends in college who were like, I don't know what I want to do with my life, and like my mom's telling me I should just do this. And I was thinking, wow, like they're actually kind of being
Directed.
guided. Yeah,
Mm.
like their parents are actually helping them figure out what might be best for them, rather than just saying you can be anything you want, which in some ways could mean, you know, you have to figure out what you're going to
Right.
do with your life. And
Right.
that's when you're young, that can be exhilarating, and then you look back and think, I wish I had a mentor. I wish I had had guidance.
Right. Well, I guess the OT and PT, the occupational therapy or physical therapy is more you can do it as a mother. I mean, or you can figure
Right.
out your times and try to, schedule it in
Yeah.
a way that works. So I guess that's
Yeah.
why some were going into it. But
It fits into like a vision of your
right,
life.
right.
It's like all the pieces. Yeah.
I find it intriguing though. Like a lot of people look at religious women, observant women, Jewish women I'm talking about, and see it as oppressive, see these rules as oppressive. Yet here you're coming from this background where there was all this freedom, and you're seeing it in the other way. You're seeing it as something that's a positive for women. Like
Yeah.
it's just an interesting, way of looking at it. Like, why do you think that was that you saw it as so
Yeah.
beautiful and directed?
So I will say that it took me a few years to
Hmm.
navigate the many pieces of this transition
Hmm.
that I went on, because there
Hmm.
were aspects of Orthodox Judaism that rubbed me the wrong way,
I'm
that
sure.
I felt were frustrating. That the women didn't necessarily be able to choose any career they want. I
Hmm.
thought, well, I wasn't 100% sold. I thought, well, maybe that's not great for everybody.
Right.
I had aspects of it that I struggled with, but interestingly, looking back, I see the ways that feminism had taught me to think about a world being entirely different. And in some ways, feminism had succeeded with that. But I felt like there was this initial interest in the beginning of the feminist movement to recreate the world, take things that we assume at face value, and find like a whole new reality. So for feminism, that was masculine versus feminine. So
Hmm.
if men had built a world, a social and political world based off of masculine values, masculine bodies, like masculine visions, all of those things, then what would a feminine version look like? And I was
Hmm.
very interested in that. And I actually took that idea with me when I encountered Orthodox Judaism. And I thought, well, if women and men are doing different things, does that necessarily mean the women are oppressed or the women are second class?
Hmm.
What are the women doing that's interesting? That
Hmm.
that was it kind of was a mindset shift. Instead of thinking equality is
The
that
sameness.
women should be able to do every single thing a man does in the exact same way, but you're always going to hit up against biology. A
Hmm.
man cannot do everything a woman can do. He cannot
Hmm.
give birth. He cannot nurse
Mm.
his kids. And I also felt like this was taboo in women's studies to say, but I also felt like as a majority, men and women had slightly different social and psychological skills as well.
Right.
With women multitasking and men's advancements in math and physics, people would always say, well, it's only because women aren't allowed into those departments. And I always thought, it just seems like a lot more men are interested in those topics, and
Mhm.
to kind of, I feel like some of my frustrations with the feminist movement was like butting up against kind of some of these like generalizations that we do find,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
gendered characteristics that we do find in society, and like always trying to be forcing them to be suppressed under this idea of sameness or equality.
Right.
um,
Right.
and so when I was kind of introduced to a woman's role in Judaism, I was just curious for a while,
Right.
holding alongside my suspicions and like not 100% believing in God yet, but then like a lot of curiosity, like
Hmm.
what does
So
this
so
community
y
have?
you mean you looked at it as, like, this might be a woman's vision of living in a feminine world, like, let's see what that looked like, kind of.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's great,
absolutely.
that's great. I think that's a little bit like really how the Rebbe looks at it. I mean, how did you get into later on into Chabad Hasidus and the Rebbe's perspective? Tell us a little about that.
Okay, so to make a very long story shorter, because this is like the next like 5 years or so of my life.
Right.
But after college, I went to seminary in Israel for 2 years.
After so
I started.
you were ready what kind of degree did you finished
I
your
finished my
undergrad?
bachelor's,
Mhm,
my undergrad.
mhm,
I got my major in women's studies, but along the way, I started keeping Shabbos and
mm,
kosher and dressing more modestly. And
mhm,
so by the time I graduated, I was like, okay, I'm going to go to Israel and get the Jewish education that I never got.
mhm,
So I went for 2 years. And in the middle of the first year, I was not in a Chabad seminary. And I was seeing around me in the ultra Orthodox world, like a little bit more of the kind of set roles for women than I was
mm,
comfortable with. And I
mhm,
didn't think it was, terrible or oppressive, but I didn't feel like it was 100% right for me personally.
mhm, mhm.
And I had a friend in the Chabad seminary in Sfat. And so I went for a Shabbos and I hung out up there and I was like, oh, I like these girls. I like the more, kind of hippie vibe. And so I decided to go to a Chabad seminary. I ended up going to two different ones. And I was just exposed to the breadth of Chabad teachings. Um, and in so many ways, it drew me in. And one of the things I loved, one thing that had been a really big barrier for me was women not learning the Talmud, the oral
Mhm,
law.
mhm,
And in the non Chabad ultra Orthodox world, women generally don't learn those texts.
mhm.
And that was one of my first questions when I got to the Chabad seminar. I was like, what did the Rebbe say about this?
Yeah,
And they were like, no, we have a Talmud class. The Rebbe said
right,
that women are exposed to everything now, and their Jewish education should be on that level.
right.
And it clicked for me right away. Like even before I knew that much about the Rebbe's teachings, this was a big entryway for me to think
Mhm,
like if the Rebbe saw this and he had this foresight that I'm coming from a college education, I can study anything in the world I want, to approach a Judaism where I'm kind of closed off from certain areas was hard for me. And so to see in Chabad that that wasn't the case was a big deal. Um, and so
interesting.
over the years, I always had this strong desire to take my feminist training and really deeply look at gender in Chabad Hasidus and understand the relationship between the two and understand what Hasidus brings out in the feminine that I didn't end up finding in feminism.
Mhm.
And so I came back from Israel and I worked for a few years and I decided, okay, I'm going to apply for my PhD. And in order to figure out this research question.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
what did you find out?
What did I find out?
Yeah, like, what does Chabad say about feminism? What does the
Yeah.
Rebbe feel about feminism? What how would you answer that? Are
Okay.
you a
So
feminist now? I'm throwing all these
yes.
questions at you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I identify as a Hasidic feminist.
And what is that how
Um,
would you define that?
a Hasidic feminist. Okay. So first I have to answer your other questions and then we'll get
Sure.
to the definition. So what did I find? So I started digging into the sichas and the teachings, the talks of the Rebbe. And I started finding over and over again this larger philosophy about a woman's role. And then if you go back into the more Kabbalistic, mystical text, you have a more abstract idea about the dynamic between masculine and feminine.
Mhm.
And what happens is you find that the feminine has something very, very powerful. that the masculine doesn't have: the ability to innovate something entirely new that has never existed in the world.
Mhm.
So the way it works is that the masculine is the giver. And so the more revealed, content or the idea, like, it originates in a masculine part. And this is also within us. I think it's the easiest way to understand. Within our own psyche, we have a masculine and feminine characteristic. So the masculine part is where this kind of idea originates, this spark, this inspiration, this first beginning. But then when it comes into the feminine, like in reproduction, the male and the woman, when it comes into this womb, this place of birth, something entirely new is created. And why is that? Because the feminine comes from a higher source in God. The feminine
Mhm.
comes from the essence of God.
Mm.
And because of this dynamic, the feminine is able to bring something new into the world. So if you have this spark of idea and it's just staying abstract, that's very nice and you can intellectualize it, but nothing physically is changing. What you need to do is take that idea and bring it into the feminine, and then you unpack it, and all the details are built until you can birth the idea, like birthing a new child. And
Mhm.
I was always really, really fascinated by a woman's unique capacity to birth and to have a child. I thought it was the huge lack in feminism that we didn't like have books and books about this. Like, this is the woman's thing. Like, we can
Right.
give birth. Like, it is absolutely incredible. It is the entire foundation of human civilization and animal civilization, that the feminine has the capacity to give birth. And it is epically amazing. And I love that in Hasidus, it is not only recognized, first of all, as the foundation of Jewish continuity for the Jewish people, that a woman's role of having children is foundational to Judaism and to our peoplehood, but also on a mystical level, there's a whole deep explanation of this dynamic. And
Mm.
the feminine walks away with something very, very deep and powerful the masculine doesn't have. The important part for me, though, also as a feminist, is that we have to acknowledge the masculine role as well. So it's very nice that feminism is always raising up women, but in some ways, I feel like the next step in understanding gender in the world is to understand the relationship between the masculine and the feminine
Mm.
and honoring both of those parts. And that's something that I think the Rebbe does very well.
How does the Rebbe do that? In what way? By seeing both as go ahead.
As
Yeah.
essential. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so the Rebbe does have a few very strong talks where he says women's liberation is terrible for a society, for women. What does it mean when women say we want to be the same as men? It reveals their own insecurity as women. The
Mm.
greatest lack of self-confidence, the Rebbe
Mhm.
says, is when you want to just be like someone else. We
Mhm.
know this with social media. If you look at your social media feed and be like, oh, I wish I was that person, what does that reveal about you? That you don't really, really deeply like who you are. So the
Right.
Rebbe says that one of the fundamental aspects of having a society where women have the same role as men is that women don't understand the worth of their role.
Mhm.
And men and women are both essential in a society functioning. And to go back to my
So
almost
I guess it
entire,
means, like, realizing your worth as a woman, realizing your worth and what you do as a woman rather than trying to make yourself into a man.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, and uncovering that worth. And so for me, that's one of the aspects of the Hasidic feminism of the Rebbe, is to always be drawing out the worth of women,
Mhm.
but in a way, and this is important, and this is a big part of my research, what the Rebbe does, I feel, is he takes the tradition, Jewish tradition, and a woman's traditional role across all societies, and he lets naturally the innovation evolve from that tradition. Because the Rebbe did innovate in a woman's
Mhm.
role.
Mhm.
Traditionally, women were not public leaders in Judaism, let's say. And now, all across the world, you have Chabad women who are, Rebbetzins
Mhm.
leading communities with their husbands. You are
Mhm.
working for Chabad.org, running this amazing podcast, and,
Right.
and empowered by the Rebbe, because the Rebbe, wanted women to go out and influence people when they had that unique power.
But
And he
we
does.
do have that. I mean, we have that with Sarah, with our first foremother, right? Which she was right there at the forefront with Abraham, standing there doing her role.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
know it's true, and I love researching the history of women. You always have that, but it was not on a large scale,
Right.
and it would not be considered appropriate for every woman.
Right.
If somebody, and also one of the things I think that shifted was that it was usually a woman's role was tied to her husband. So if the
Mm.
husband had a position in society, then the woman would be able to have one. And
Mhm.
in many ways, the Rebbe would look at women as individuals, obviously
Mhm.
part of a family unit, and that's
Mhm.
important. But also, what is her unique characteristics and talents that she can use?
Mhm.
Um, and so
Now,
a lot
what
of
if some
yeah,
people
go
are
ahead.
listening though and feeling like I'm not the traditional I'm not the stereotypical feminine, and I've had this question asked to me sometimes, like, I see myself more as the masculine and my spouse is more as the feminine, people will say to me. Like, how would you
Yeah.
respond to that?
Yeah. This is a really important issue for me because I think one of the reasons I was so drawn to feminism is I always felt like I had very masculine characteristics.
Mm.
Being very, very intellectual and academic often meant that I didn't like to have small talk and schmooze with the girls
Right,
sometimes. Yeah, I
right.
sometimes felt like I don't have that kind of naturally very, very feminine side. So here's a few answers that I have to that. One is that we all have masculine and feminine characteristics
Mhm.
within us. And
And
it's
it's important to
perfectly
realize that, yes.
yes, and it's
Yes.
perfectly natural and normal. You don't have to fit into a box. Um, but the other thing that has been very, very important part of my journey is getting married and having children,
I
and
was just gonna ask you that
realizing
about that as well, yes.
that I might actually have this latent femininity within me
Mhm.
that I never really felt comfortable to explore, or I never invested in kind of building up. Like
Mm,
I think I was so successful in some ways because I leaned into my masculine side,
mm,
and I, got did well in school and I got a PhD, and I needed to use that very analytic, to go back to I was saying in the Kabbalistic mode, like that kind of ideal intellectual
mhm,
abstract part, which is defined as more
mhm.
masculine. But then what about that feminine part of me that is more, receptive, more warm, can create the calm environment of my home. And that takes a lot of putting together the pieces of, what
Do you
does each
feel
person need? Like
do you feel that you're leaning more into your femininity as
femininity.
femininity
Yeah.
as you
Yeah.
become as you are a mother?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen a huge difference from when my first child was born. He's 5.5 now. And
Mm,
then I have two much younger kids, a 1 year old and a 2 year old. And with him, it was, in some ways, there was like a huge loss of independence when
mhm,
I became a mother. That was really hard for me. Um, and then, and then over time, like readjusting my whole life towards my kids, I
mhm,
felt like when my next two kids were born, there was this kind of this like acceptance, like my life is more on my kids' schedule, and that's actually going to build me. And
mhm.
it's not all going to be just about me. I'm going to have to make choices for other people around me. And it's definitely been a shift, but one that's I think sometimes we to
And
go
you're
way back. Yeah, go ahead.
no, you're comfortable with those, like, so-called sacrifices that you're making for your children, rather than the independence or the careers that you could be pursuing if you didn't have that?
Not always. Sometimes it's difficult. I like to look at it in the long game.
Mhm,
When individual moments where I have to say no to applying for a job in a different state because we don't want to move our family again or something like
mhm,
that. I
mhm,
think in 10 or 15 years, am I going to be most happy that I published two papers and I have this professorship somewhere? Or am I going to be like, Baruch Hashem, God willing, I have, six children and like they're
mhm,
all thriving. And
mhm,
and I have to also always be feeding myself, always be feeling like, I have most of the day my kids are in childcare. I teach high school, I write, I give
mhm,
presentations. I I want to I don't necessarily call it a sacrifice, but a
mhm,
realignment, or
mhm,
maybe even creating a balance
mhm,
rather than saying it's one or the other, to see how
mhm,
can I make space for both of these parts of my life.
mhm. And you think that women have to do that more than men?
Yeah, I do think so. But interestingly, one of the parts of the Rebbe's teachings, which I think about a lot, was his directive in Chabad to have a large family.
Mhm,
And one of the women I spoke to about this, she was saying, she had some friends in a different community that had, 4 or 5 kids, and they were like, okay, like I'm managing. And she's like, if the Rebbe wants me to have 8 or 10 kids, my husband better be on board. He better be helping with carpool. He
You
better,
better.
you know.
Absolutely.
And she was like, the Rebbe made this a directive, not just for the women, for the men also.
Absolutely. It's
They,
takes
all hands on deck.
for
So,
sure. If it takes a
so
village to raise a child, it's definitely both parents, right, have to be well on board.
yeah.
Sure.
Um, and I think that there's layers to that question
Mhm.
of,
Mhm.
the biological aspect of being pregnant and nursing and
Mm.
just not being able to do as much during that time, and how that affects your career when you take those breaks. Whereas for my husband, he can continue building his career while those are happening.
Right.
But also I think sometimes as an individual couple, like my husband and I have conversations where I say I really want to be public speaking more around the
Mhm.
country. And
Mhm.
he's like, okay, you got invited to somewhere where you could drive. Let's do that one before you take the one in California, And I'm
Right.
like, sometimes I'm like, oh, it's frustrating. And then I think, you know what? Like, I want this family to function well. I don't,
Right.
I want to,
Right.
make sure I'm making choices that are looking at that long game. And I don't have to say no to public speaking. Maybe right
Right.
now I have to say yes to less than a 2 hour flight,
Sure, sure. Well, interesting, when I started public speaking, it was when my youngest was born, and I didn't want to be out all day without her, away from her, and I felt it was easier to go out once a week or once a month to travel
Mm,
rather than so it's both
that's
sides of the
interesting.
coin, it's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. When you look back at yourself, at your younger self, what are your thoughts? Like, you've had such a journey, that you've come so far. Like, what do you think about when you think back to
Yeah.
your younger self, and what would you tell her, or
Yeah.
you know, what would you want her to know?
Ugh, I wish I could just tell her so many times, "It's going to be fine." Like, it's all gonna
Right.
turn out great. Like, you're gonna get
Right.
married, you're gonna have kids, you're gonna get your PhD, you're going to be able to write books, and, I am, like, so, so grateful for the stage I'm at in my life
Mhm.
now. I
Mhm.
feel like my 30s are gonna be my best decade, um, I feel like growing up without a strong community, without a strong religious tradition, in the beginning of the cell phone generation, I think there was so much, I went through so much loneliness and so much confusion. And I had such a desire when my parents got divorced to like have my own home. And I just didn't see how all of this was going to come together,
Mhm.
and it
Wow.
was hard for a long time to feel like I don't have a path in front of me.
Right.
Um, and that path only like really crystallized, I've been married for 6 years, and I feel like a year or two before I got married was when I started feeling like, okay, things are moving in the right direction now, but
Right. What
but
do you
yeah,
most like about your religious life as a Hasidic woman?
ugh. I love I love that my community has regular events and learning events for women every
Mhm.
week. I get
Mhm.
together with my friends, and we don't just schmooze, we don't, talk about shopping or kids' clothes, even though that's fun.
Mhm.
But we sit around and we study Torah, and we
Right.
discuss really deep ideas.
Is it
Um,
the academic of it or the spiritual part of it that you love the most, or both?
um, Definitely both, and the hands-on aspect, and, like, the practical, now tomorrow, I'm gonna wake up with, like, a little bit of a little mindset shift, every
Mm,
time you dive
mhm,
into the text.
mhm.
Yeah.
And what do you see for you? Do you have boys or girls, children?
I have 2 boys and a girl.
2 boys and a girl. And what would you like to see for them? What would you envision that you wanna make as a mother,
Mm,
what are you trying to create for them?
wow, that's such a good question. Um, yeah, they're still so little. I'm like
Right, of
sometimes
course.
I'm like, "Let me make through this
Just
day."
go through the day, right, of course. How
Um,
how old are they?
1, 2, and 5.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, you have
Yeah,
some time to think about that.
yeah. But,
Right,
no,
wow.
I mean, I listened to a podcast once about, Bali Chuva, people who become
Mhm,
religious, and
mhm,
what really struck with me was that I can have a lot of lofty spiritual goals for my family,
mhm.
but the most important thing is to have a functional, safe, normal family life.
100%, for sure.
The kids are happy, they're taken care of, they have cute clothes, they have food, sometimes it's peanut butter and jelly for dinner,
Right?
but, like, they're fed,
They're fine
and,
with that. They probably love
you know
that the best, right?
yeah. Yeah,
A
because I think, in this day and age, the more we learn about mental health and all
For
these things, like
sure.
the more stability and self-confidence and resilience we can give our kids, then I hope they'll make the choices that I hope they'll make, but I
Right.
can't make those choices for them, and giving them the kind of building blocks that they're confident in who they are. That's what I want the
100%.
most.
And do you see a difference in how you raise your boys and girls, or is it similar?
It's interesting because my daughter is 2.5, and in the past few months, she started telling me, "Mommy, I only wear skirts. I only wear dresses." And when I
Right.
put a dress on her, she runs up to me and she holds it up. She says, "Mommy, we're matching." Like, it's so cute. She
So
happens to be
sweet.
very like verbal early on, and she's like,
Right.
she's very strong personality. And it's interesting because the Rebbe had this directive that girls at the age of 3 should start lighting Shabbos candles and dressing in skirts and like
Mhm.
modest dress.
Modestly.
And I used to think like, wow, 3 is so young, like for that.
Mm.
Why? And I started realizing that if I want my daughter to grow up as like really, really valuing herself as a woman, I'm going to be that role model for her.
Mm.
And so even
Mhm.
at 2.5, she looks at me and she's like, I want to be like mommy. I want to dress
Wow.
like you. You wear skirts. Why do I have to wear pants?
Right.
And I think that's the best thing we can give to our kids, that they look up to us and they want to emulate us.
100%. Wow, that's beautiful. Really beautiful. So you never answered how you define yourself as a Hasidic feminist.
Mm.
Is there can you say it in a nutshell, or is it a whole doctoral thesis that we have
No,
to
no, no,
read?
I'm trying. I'm trying. I know the academic in me is like, well, if you have 300 pages of
Right.
reading, but no, I mean, I think what we're doing is bringing bringing tradition into the conversation about womanhood in a new way,
Mhm.
and changing kind of static ideas of what it means to be a woman, but illuminating through the light of Hasidic mystical tradition to
Mhm.
show that the feminine is really what's going to elevate the world.
Wow, beautiful. And what are your plans for your future? What would you like to see in your future? I mean, we spoke
Um,
about what you would say to the old version of you.
yeah.
What would you say to the future version of yourself? What do you hope to be?
Um, so actually, interestingly, my husband and I read this book recently called Good Work, and it's about like what is like the work that makes your heart sing, that you enjoy. And I've been really thinking about this, and I've been realizing that writing is really my passion. I love to
Mhm.
teach. I always see myself teaching. I'm teaching high school now. I hope to start teaching in college next year. But I see myself doing a lot more writing, a lot more speaking. And really, the goal of all of these pieces is to bring my passion for what it means to be a woman through light of Hasidus to more
Mhm.
people. And hopefully, also in general, just to bring more clarity on this topic. So, like for my younger self who is struggling to, if I can show one woman, one girl that, no one's going to tell you who to be, but there is a roadmap and there is a guide,
Right.
and to
Right.
make that clear. Um, yeah. And I hope that for my family, I can, expand on all these things and then keep them in the front of my mind always.
100%. Wow, that's beautiful. Do you see our world evolving to be a more feminine world?
In some ways, yes. Yeah. In some ways, I think that there's been a lot of shifts towards feminine ways of doing things. I won't go in. There's been a whole discussion about this on like Silicon Valley and like Google, how they're moving towards more family friendly policies and also like more
Right.
less hierarchical ways of doing things. But but on the other hand, sometimes it can feel like we're heading towards a cliff and we have to just fall off and then we can
Right.
rebuild. Like
Right.
sometimes the world seems like pretty scary place.
Well, I mean, there was a lot of people who were very upset with the feminists who didn't say anything after October 7th, with
Mm,
all that was done to women.
yeah.
That was but on the other hand, we see the world also evolving in a positive way.
I think some of the feelings that feminism has not accomplished what it was supposed to. A lot. I think a lot of people in society, I use the term Hasidic feminism because I think it evokes a certain image, which is helpful to break down people's assumptions sometimes. But in many ways, I think people don't identify with feminism as much, and I
Mhm.
think that could be a good thing because
Mhm.
I think we need a new way of thinking about gender.
Mhm.
Like I said, where we allow a lot of people to express their gender in different ways, and yet we kind of have to be realistic about healthy families being built on, safe relationships, and that happens through really understanding the masculine feminine dynamic.
Hmm. Absolutely. Wow. It's been incredible to talk to you, Chava. Thank you so much for joining us. I wish you tremendous success in your motherhood and in your personal fulfillment and in your career aspirations in the future. I'm
Thank you
sure
so
we'll be hearing great things from you.
much.
Thank you
God
for
willing.
joining
Thanks so
us.
much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Wow, I found that interview with Chava Green so interesting as a person who's always been interested in women's studies and in women in Judaism and feminism in Torah and Hasidic study. It was really interesting for me, and I felt I could have gone on with her for a long, long time, except for the time constraints. What I found particularly interesting, aside from her entire journey of how she found Judaism and how you see really the hand of God, as we see so often in so many of these interviews, the hand of God guiding her. So she didn't get into the universities that she applied to, but got into specifically Rutgers, which was obviously for a reason, and how she went on to her birthright trip, obviously for a reason, and the people that she met and encountered in her life, which was obviously God pulling her in a certain direction, which is so beautiful that we see it so often in our lives and in so many of these interviews and podcasts that we present to you. But what I found particularly interesting with her was the things that she, often people look from the outside and they look at people who are keeping Judaism, the women of Judaism, and they look at it as in a more oppressive way. They see Judaism with its rules as more oppressive and something that doesn't appreciate women. And here, because she had such freedom and such openness and she was kind of disillusioned with that openness in the society that she was in, that she was able to appreciate that perhaps there's a new dimension to what Judaism is providing, to what Torah is providing, to having that framework of rules and having that framework of culture and having that framework of a God-given body of knowledge and mitzvot that we have, that really enhances our life and that helps us as women to lead a more feminine perspective. So I found that really, really intriguing and interesting. And I'm sure you, like me, are going to keep a tab on Chava Green to see where her future leads. It looks like she has exciting things ahead in her life. If you enjoy watching these interviews, I hope that you are subscribed to Chabad.org/extraordinary. We're also available on Spotify or Apple or all podcast platforms. Please make sure you leave a comment, a like, tell us something, give us some feedback. We really, really appreciate hearing from you. What was it about Chava's journey that inspired you? Do you relate to this Hasidic feminism that she is talking about? And what does being a woman in Judaism really mean to you? Or if you're a man watching this, what do you feel is the feminine perspective in Judaism? And how does that talk to you? Thank you so much for watching Ordinary People with Extraordinary Stories. And thank you so much for being part of this extraordinary community.